What's up guys, my name is Tony, and today I'm going to give you a quick and painless guide on daily driving NixOS from scratch with Flakes and Home Manager. This is a relevant quote from a famous philosopher from 2026. In many respects, if Arch and Debian had a son, his name would be NixOS. As I've said before, NixOS really is the endgame of Linux due to its reproducibility and its stability in nature. Because of Flakes, which allow you to pin your packages to a specific commit, and Home Manager, which enables you to version control and reproduce your user configs, the combination of these powerful tools really make NixOS both rock solid like Debian and bleeding edge like Arch. Alright, let's jump right into the installation today. Over at nixos.org, I am in the download section, and we have the graphical ISO image option and the minimal ISO image option. You can feel free to use the graphical installer if you want, but I think you know which one we're going to choose. Alright, let's go ahead and load up this NixOS 25.05 minimal installer here, and let's start this up. Alright, we are automatically logged in here, and we can start the process today. Alright, following the manual installation guide here, the first step says to use the sudo-i command so we can hop into the root user. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll go ahead and do sudo-i to get into that root user. And these commands will look very familiar if you've installed Arch before. We're basically going to be dictating what the hardware.nix file ends up looking like. Let's jump into it here by starting out with typing lsblk to confirm the name of our disk, and let's go ahead and create our partition scheme by typing cfdisk dev vda, and for you guys it might be dev sda, depends on your machine. We're going to go ahead and select GPT for the label. For the first partition, we're going to hit enter on new, type 1G, and for the type, we're going to select EFI system, because we are on an EFI system today. For the second partition, we'll type 4G for our 4GB swap partition. And for the type, we will just select Linux swap. And for our last partition, we can just hit enter twice to use the rest of the space for the root partition. And we can leave that as a Linux file system. Alright, let's go ahead and write, type yes to confirm that, hit enter, and we can quit. And let's sanity check this with an lsblk to confirm. And there we go. We've got our 3 partitions we just made. So let's jump into creating those file systems. So I do already have a video on the minimal installation of NixOS. We will be going through this part rather quickly, but I do have a written guide in the link below the subscribe button for this part, so go ahead and follow along that if needed. Alright, for that root file system, we'll do mkfs.ext4-l for label. We'll name that NixOS. That's going to be dev vda3. Beautiful. And for the swap partition, we'll do mkswap-l for label again, swap dev vda2. Alright. And for our boot partition today, we're going to do mkfs.fat-f32, n for the name. And we'll do boot here, dev vda1, and we can ignore the lowercase warning we're about to get, because those labels will definitely work on our system. Alright, so we've made those file systems, time to mount them. So we'll do mount dev vda3. We'll mount that to MNT. For the boot partition, we'll do mount --mkdir dev vda1. We're gonna mount that to MNT/boot. And for the swap, very simple, swap on dev vda2. Alright, one more lsblk for a sanity check. And there we go. We see our mounted file partitions, and they look good to go. So it's time to generate that config file. And looking at the official NixOS installation handbook, all we have to do is run this command here, NixOS generate config. So let's go ahead and just run that. That's going to be NixOS generate config --root/mnt. All right. And this is where we're going to drift away from the standard install, because we're actually going to be creating a Flake and a Home.nix file immediately. So let's cd into mnt etc NixOS. And let's touch those files here. Let's create flake.nix and home.nix in here. So we do see we've got these 4 files in this directory. We've got the configuration file, got the hardware configuration file that was just generated from those commands we just ran, and we just created those 2 files, flake.nix and home.nix. Okay, this is a side note, but I just googled Vim to load up the Vim documentation, and it literally says, did you mean Emacs? And Vim is not even spelled anywhere near close to Emacs, so I think somebody at Google hard-coded that when someone searches for Vim, they want to suggest them to use Emacs instead. Based. Alright, so I'm going to be using Vim today to edit these files. If you're somebody who's not comfortable in Vim, I do recommend just installing the very bare minimum amount of packages that are needed to launch your system up, as well as your text editor of choice. And that could be Emacs, VS Code, Notepad++, what have you. But if you're built like me, just follow along with Vim and we'll get everything done. Alright, let's jump into that flake.nix file first. Vim flake.nix. This is where we define where our packages come from, so both configuration and home.nix can inherit them through the flake and use them consistently. We'll create the skeleton for this file here. For the description, you can do whatever you want. This is just supposed to document the flake. This one for me is going to be called NixOS from scratch because that's what today's video is all about. And we will add an inputs set here. And inside that, we'll do nixpkgs.url. And we're going to set that to nixpkgs NixOS-25.05. That is the current version of NixOS that I'm on. Nixpkgs is shorthand for GitHub:/NixOS/nixpkgs. So we'll be using that. Let's define our home manager inside of our flake so that we can use our flake to manage home manager. And we'll explain how and why that makes sense a little bit later here, but let's type home manager. And we'll set the URL equal to GitHub Nix community home manager release 25.05, and that's going to be so that it's in sync with our NixOS version. And we'll do inputs.nixpkgs.follows equals nixpkgs. And what that does is that will prevent Home Manager from pulling its own version of Nix packages, keeping everything consistent and avoiding mismatched packet sets. Alright, that's good for the inputs, so let's go ahead and define the outputs. And the arguments we'll be passing in are going to be self, nixpkgs, home manager, and ... just in case we have any later. So we're going to set NixOS configurations.nixOS by the way, and that's going to be the name of your hostname. This is just going to define our ecosystem for this hostname in particular. And we'll set that equal to nixpkgs.lib.nixOS system. We'll do system equals, and for me I'm on x86 architecture, so we'll do x86_64 Linux. And for the modules, this module section is going to tell our flake to build the system using configuration.nix, so we need to point the modules to that. So we'll do ./configuration.nix. And we also want to use home manager inside these modules, so let's do home manager.nixOS modules.home-manager. It's a little bit verbose. And let's give some global settings here for home manager. It's going to be home manager equals. We're going to set use global pkgs to true. We'll set use user packages to true. And we're going to set users.tony to import home.nix. And for you, obviously, change your username to whatever your username is going to be. And this is really important here. Let's do backup file extension equals backup. So what that does is that ensures that when you download a config file with Home Manager and there already exists one on your system, instead of crashing, it'll move your existing config file to a backup directory. All right, that looks good to go. So let's go ahead and let's save this file here. Let's do escape :right quit. And we're ready to jump into our configuration.nix file. So let's jump into that here. Vim configuration.nix. See this massive file here. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down a little bit here. A lot of it's comments. We have 123 lines. So don't get overwhelmed. This is actually a beautiful thing that you're looking at, not a scary thing. And I'm hoping to convert you into that mindset. So one of the beautiful things about NixOS is that your system is defined in various config files. You can think of this almost like how your window manager is defined with config files, and you can port your window manager .files to another distribution or another computer and use the same keybinds and options on both machines. Well, NixOS has a config file that lives above these window manager .files from a hierarchy perspective, which means you can take your NixOS config, slap it on a different machine, and have your exact setup with all your .files and all your config settings on that machine. Alright, so I'm going to start off the process here by deleting a lot of comments. So let's delete that. I'm going to delete that because I don't need that. Delete the comment. I'll leave these settings here because I do want system deboot today. We're going to uncomment the hostname, and I'm going to change this to NixOS BTW. For networking, I'm not on wireless, so I will delete this wireless comment and I'll enable network manager. But if you're on wireless, obviously you do the reverse. All right, for the time zone, for my situation, I am going to be changing this to America, Los Angeles. We can delete these proxy comments because we're not going to be setting up a proxy today. And we can delete these keyboard properties because the defaults are pretty sane, which moves us into the Xserver situation. Alright, so let's move Xserver into its own attribute set, similar to what we did in our Flake with the home manager stuff. So we're going to call this services.xserver. We're going to set that equal to a set here, and we'll enable it. A couple more settings here for quality of life. It's going to be auto repeat delay equals 200, auto repeat interval equals 35, and to quote DistroTube, resistance is futile. We're going to switch back to Qtile, which means we're going to set our window manager .qtile enable equals true. So that looks good here. And these two settings dictate the key repeat rate. And this is equivalent of doing the xset_r rate 235 command, similar to what we did in our Hyperland video. And we're going to be using the super minimal lie display manager. It's very, very lightweight and blazingly fast. It's really all you need in my opinion. So let's enable that. We will do services.displayManager.ly.enable equals true. Yeah, one more convenient thing about NixOS is that it has options like this just built into the kit. So we don't have to tinker with the desktop files or display manager files. We just enable it, one line. We can delete the rest of the comments here until the user section. And for the user section here, I'm going to uncomment the users set. And to do that in Vim, I'm going to do Control-V, 6J-L-X. So try that out if you can do it. That's a quick way to uncomment it. I'm going to change Alice to Tony. I'm going to leave the rest as is. And we will enable Firefox on the system level today. That's totally fine. Alright, same thing with the packages here. Let's delete these two comments and do a Control-V, 3J-LX to uncomment that. For the system level packages today, I'm going to get Vim in case we want to use sudo vim. We'll do git and we'll do alacrity for our terminal. Alright, some more comments here. We can delete the rest of these because we're not going to enable SSH or any of this firewall stuff because the same defaults are pretty good here. So yeah, we can just delete these comments here. Let's get our font set up here. We're going to do fonts.packages equals with pkgs nerd fonts.jetbrains mono. Close that out. And let's actually enable Flakes here. So we'll do nix.settings.experimental features. It's going to be equal to nix command and Flakes. That's just obviously going to turn on Flakes for us and turn on nix command so we can run nix flake update. We can just delete this massive comment here. We can, did we read the comment? Yeah, we totally read that comment, so we can delete this comment about that comment. And we are good to go. So we trimmed down a 127 line file to a 49 line file. It's pretty good. I mean, a lot of that was comments, but we have some pretty basic settings here. I encourage you to tinker with this later. But yeah, this is going to be a very, very good starting position for us. So let's go ahead and save and quit that file. :WQ. And lastly, we need to set up our home.nix file. And we're going to do a super minimal home.nix file right now. And we'll heavily modify that after we actually boot into our system. For now, let's open it with vim home.nix. Let's define config packages ... top of this file as the inputs, and what we're going to do for the outputs are going to be, let's do home.username equals Tony, home.home directory, specify our home directory here, home/Tony, and you can enable programs in the same way we did the Firefox command on the system level. Let's do that for git. We'll do programs.git.enable equals true, specify our home state version to 25.05, and to ensure that this actually all works, let's enable bash and then set an alias with it so we can run that right when we launch in. We'll do programs.bash equals enable true shell aliases. We'll set the alias btw to echo I use NixOS, by the way. And that's going to be a simple sanity check to see if this all worked. Alright, that looks pretty good. Let's save and quit that file. Alright, we're finally ready to install this. So let's clear out the terminal here. So for the manual here, it does tell you exactly what to do. It says we got to run NixOS install, and we're going to pass in that Flake argument and just give the path to the Flake and specify the host name. So we're literally going to do exactly that. So we'll do NixOS install -- Flake, and the path to that's going to be mnt etc NixOS, and the host name that we set was NixOS btw because I use Nix, by the way. And if we didn't make any typos, which would be kind of insane, we should be able to hit enter, let this rip, and everything should be good to go. So let's run it. Alright, looking good so far, so I'll let that run and I will see you shortly. Beautiful. It actually worked first try. Incredible. So we can ignore this mount point warning about boot. That is just complaining that the boot directory is readable by all users, which is fine for us in this context. But yeah, it's prompting us to set that root password up, so we're gonna do that. And there we go, installation finished. That's actually incredible that that worked first try. One more thing we have to do is set a password to our user, otherwise we will not be able to log into it. So let's do NixOS-enter --root mnt-c, and we're gonna run password Tony. And again, that's gonna be your user. There we go, password set up. Looks like we're ready to actually finally boot into our system. And we are good to reboot here. So let's see how fast this loads. And there we go, we immediately see our system deboot here. And I'm not gonna edit this, holy, yeah, I did not edit that. That was actually how fast we booted. Incredible, wonderful, incredible, and amazing, blazingly fast boot. So we can log in here with our user and our password that we set. This is what Lie looks like, by the way. This is a beautiful, very minimal terminal looking-esque display manager. And there we go. Beautiful default Qtile, beautiful blank wallpaper. We're actually in our NixOS environment that's flaked. Now let's confirm that the home manager stuff worked. Let's open up a terminal here with super enter and let's run btw to confirm that that alias worked. And there we go. We're on a flake with home manager off an install first try from the command line. That's incredible. Subscribe. All right, so let's actually make a .files directory in this system so that we can version control it. So we're gonna do mkdir NixOS .files. And we can cd into that. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna copy the configuration files that were used to build the system and store them in this folder so that we can version control and pull this down on any other machine as needed, because it will be owned by our user. So we'll do a sudo cp-r etc NixOS star so we can get everything in that directory. And we'll just put it right here in dot. So we do see all these files here and they are owned by root, so let's fix that with a sudo shown-r for recursive, Tony users. We'll run that on this whole directory as well. Clear that. And there we go. Now we own these files. So let's go ahead and grab our Qtile config and throw it into our NixOS.files repo. Mkdir config, and we'll go into that config folder here. So we'll run git clone https://github.com tonybanters/Qtile. And while we're doing this, let's do the same thing with our Neovim configuration. So we'll run the same command here, but instead of Qtile, we'll go ahead and do nvim. All right. So we've got the nvim and the Qtile directories here. So let's cd back into our NixOS.files repo. And let's open up our home.nix file to tell our home manager to use that Qtile config. So we'll do a vim home.nix. And down here below the bash set, we can do home.file.quote.config/Qtile.source, and we're going to set that source equal to ./config Qtile, because that is where the file is relative to the home.nix file. And we can do the same thing here with Neovim. So we'll replace Qtile with nvim. We can save that. For Neovim to work, we do need to add some packages here, so let's go ahead and make a packages list. Home.packages equals with pkgs, because we've imported that at the top. And we'll get Neovim ripgrep, which is required for Telescope to work. We'll get nil, which is a LSP for Nix languages. We'll get Nix pkgs fmt, which is another formatting tool for Nix files within our Neovim configuration. We'll grab node.js, which will be used to install the parsers with treesitter. And we'll add gcc so we can compile those parsers. And that should be good as far as the Neovim and the Qtile configs. Hopefully we can grab these and everything should look a little bit better. So that being said, we should be able to just run sudo nixos rebuild switch. I'm gonna pass in the flake parameter. It's gonna be nixos.files. And our host name is nixos, by the way. And we're building that, so I'll see you shortly. Alright, that looks like it was good to go with no errors. Let's confirm that that worked. Let's just reload our Qtile config with our binding that we know. It's gonna be control super R, and there we go, incredible. That's my Qtile config right there, inspired by DT's xmonad and Qtile config. Cool. We can also see if the Neovim config worked. Looks like we're installing a bunch of tree sitter parsers, so that's good, and some plugins. But yeah, that looks like it's good to go. Awesome. So now if we go back into that NixOS Dotfiles directory, and we run Neovim on this, there we go, that's my Neovim config. And I have a language server protocol for Nix files now, so yeah, there we go. We see unused binding. And let's test the formatter. Boom, auto formatting is good to go. That is a blazingly fast way to get your dot files all set up. But this is still suboptimal for two main reasons, and we'll get into that. The main reason is that we can't edit any of these config files because root owns them. But even if we did open that file with sudo and edit it, we wouldn't be able to get live updates as if we were editing our actual directory. Now, because NixOS's documentation is very, very good, and it's very much known for it being very good, I was able to find this GitHub commit of this mkOutOfStoreSymLink, which is technically documentation. This is the official repository for Home Manager. So we have mkOutOfStoreSymLink right here. I mean, I would say this is self-documenting. If you can't understand this, I would say maybe VS Code or Ubuntu might be more your style. I mean, that's it right there. So let's implement that. Okay, all kidding aside, we can use mkOutOfStoreSymLink to tell NixOS to create a symlink of our dot files right into our /.config instead of our NixOS store or what have you. So let's jump into our home.nix file and let's implement this. So we can do nvim dot, and go to home.nix. We're going to use xdg.config file instead of home.file because xdg.config file is for dot files that are supposed to be stored in .config, whereas home is used to store it if it's meant to be in a different location. Let's start by doing that. Let's do xdg.config file.qtile. We're going to set that equal to source config.lib.file.mkOutOfStoreSymLink, and we're going to do home Tony NixOS.files config Qtile semicolon, and we'll set recursive equal to true on that. And actually we can see with our LSP that we're looking for recursive and source, so we've got both attributes we need with this xdg.config file, so that's beautiful. So we can now delete this. So Qtile is now going to be stored with this mkOutOfStoreSymLink, and that's going to be great for us being able to get live updates on the fly. Save that, quit that file. One thing about the shell here, guys, that I've never talked about, but that's going to be Control-R, so we can actually search for commands that we've ran in the past. So let's search for switch, and there we go. We've got sudo nixos rebuild switch in our history, if you will, so we can just run that from here. That way we don't need to type it all out again. So let's let that rip. All right, let's clear that. So just to verify that that worked, what we're going to do is we're going to open our config.py here in our Qtile config folder, and let's just search for this pipe text box here, and let's just add another couple pipes. That should be something obvious. So now if we reload our config here, you'll notice that in the column section you see that that triple pipe is just right there. So we're getting live updates with our Qtile, which is exactly what we want. We'll change that back and reload that. So one elephant in the room / convenient thing about the mkOutOfStoreSymLink is that it doesn't lock you into NixOS in particular. You can just take your dot files and take them wherever you want. You don't have to just have 3 copies or 40 copies of your dot files, one for Nix, one for Debian, one for Arch. You can just have 1 copy of your dot files and use them in NixOS or use them in Arch. You don't have to lock yourself into NixOS. However, if you keep using NixOS for a while, you'll eventually get locked in and you won't want to stop using it. But yeah, this is definitely great for, let's say, somebody who is an avid distro hopper. This is great for them. I mean, so that's good for like a phase 1, but we definitely can clean that up a little bit. So let's open up our home.nix file again. And then let's actually just define a couple variables here with a let-in block. And we'll use .files equals, and we're going to do this config.home.home directory /nixos.files/config, and we'll do create symlink, and we're going to make this a function here, path config.lib.file.mkOutOfStoreSymLink path. So that's going to give us access to two variables. Basically, we're aliasing this really long verbose config.lib.file.mkOutOfStoreSymLink into just create symlink. And then same thing with our Dotfiles. We're going to use a variable for that as well so that we can reproduce that. So now with those two tricks here, let's rewrite this Qtile block to, we can change this config.lib.file.mkOutOfStoreSymLink to create symlink. And we should be able to change this to $.files/Qtile. Recursive is true still. And now that we have that in this nice clean structure, we can do the same for our Neovim just by running a quick search and replace here. And so there you go. We've got Qtile and Neovim immediately symlink. Do the same thing for Alacrity. And now we don't need these anymore, so we'll delete these, and beautiful. There we go. So we should be able to save that. Or we can search for that switch command, run that, and there we go. Looks good. So now that our Neovim and our Alacrity are sourced with that make store out of symlink, we can test that. So why don't we test that with the Alacrity file here? Let's change the font to 24. And there we go. We opened a new window and we see there it is, 24. We'll change that back to 18. But now we have access to live reloads as needed here, so that's perfect. But we can still clean this up a little bit more, and we're going to utilize a for loop, or Nix's version of a for loop. So let's jump back into that home.nix file one more time. So we're in that home.nix file here, and let's actually just create another variable in our let bind here called configs. We're going to make that a named list of all our configs. So we'll do Qtile equals Qtile. We'll do nvim as well. We'll get Alacrity in there as well. So now if we go down to this section, instead of all this code duplication, we can just do a quick loop here. Now to do this in Nix, we actually can see the reference manual has this built-in's .mapAttrs function here, and that's going to apply a function to every element in the set here. So we can go ahead and use this built-in function to do what we need. So let's do xdj.config file equals built-ins.mapAttrs. That'll be name subpath. And we're going to run that on our configs. And inside of this, we'll do source equals create symlink. We'll do .files. And then instead of actually declaring the .file directory, we'll actually just pass in that subpath variable that we just defined. And we'll do recursive equals true. So I went ahead and commented these out here. And as I saved this file, it already formatted this correctly, but this is basically a for loop that iterates over all of our configs and creates a symlink for each config using the xcg config file function, which is going to make it a lot easier for us. We don't need to duplicate the code here over and over again, just for each config. In fact, we can just delete those. And if we want to add to the configs, we don't even need to mess with the actual output section. We can just put a new config in here. So for example, if we want to put Rofi in here, we can do Rofi, right? So let's test that out. Let's add Rofi to the list here. And we'll do a git clone on the Rofi directory. We'll put that into NixOS Dotfiles config Rofi. And yeah, with that said, we should be able to run our sudo NixOS rebuild switch one more time. And there we go. In theory, we should be able to run Rofi here. There you go, there's my Rofi. We got like 6 programs installed here, which is awesome. This is a really minimal system here. But that is my Rofi theme, so it's really, really easy to just add stuff to that list. I really prefer that method. Alright, that's going to wrap it up for today's video. In our next installment of NixOS from scratch, we're going to create 2 package variables and use unstable to update stuff that we don't care if it breaks our system, and lock our core utilities to stable. This has been a heavily programming-oriented tutorial, but this will leapfrog you in your journey for NixOS. So drop something in the comments if you would like to see anything Linux related or anything specific about NixOS. Alright, it wouldn't be a proper video without an obligatory Neofetch.